You can see on your screen in front of you the title for today. In that particular title, 18th Century Social Ambition, that is one of our 6 outstanding attributes, outstanding universal value. And Elaine has come to talk to us this evening in more depth about that. But while we're looking at the screen, I just wanted to say that it is Trevor in the audience. Trevor, who contacted me? No, it doesn't seem like it. Trevor said to me after last week's event, that fabulous symbol sitting in Stall Street is looking a bit grubby and messy. Couldn't you do something about it? And during the course of this week, we put in place the preparations for it to be cleaned and looked after. So thank you, Trevor, if you're listening at home. It's really important to see that, and I'll explain a bit more about that for those of you that haven't been before. I'm sorry for those that have heard me speak before, but I've cut it down at the front end to just a couple of slides about World Heritage so that tonight's newcomers get some idea of what all this stuff means in the symbol. So, moving on, this is the agenda for this evening. And as usual with my slides, the object of the exercise is for you to read them while I'm talking about them. I'll try not to get sucked into reading out all the detail, but you can see at the bottom there, just about in red, we will be finishing as usual at or just before 9 o'clock. We will be taking questions both in the room and people are being encouraged online if you would like to submit your questions. Whilst we may not get to answer all of them this evening, what we would like you to do, particularly if you're in the room, is if you don't get your question answered, come up, write it down, because what we're going to do at the end of the series is publish all the questions from all 6 talks together with the answers, which we hope will be helpful to people. So, moving on, this short recap then is really a couple of slides just to say why I personally think that heritage is important. And as you can see down here, there are 2 words coloured in green. And whether you've been travelling around the world, travelling in Europe, or just travelling in this country, you will notice that all of those things on the screen, written in white, the absolute similarity around the world, around Europe, and even in this country, mean that we end up with perhaps only 2 things which differentiate us from elsewhere. One is our culture, and the other is our heritage. And of course, in Bath, we're enormously proud of our World Heritage status. You can see on the screen what UNESCO actually stands for. And as you can see, it was also established in 1945. And that catchphrase of building peace in the minds of men and women is not by accident that it was in 1945. What has happened since is that UNESCO has built a position in the world which, along with it as an arm of the United Nations, is looking at using heritage as a way of joining countries together, of joining individual people together because of a common interest. And therefore, World Heritage came into being following a conference in 1972. And it was in 1976 that the first World Heritage site was granted. And that was, in the capital of Ecuador, in Quito, which is where the equator runs right through the middle of the city. That and the Galapagos were the first 2 World Heritage sites. And the phrase at the bottom here about World Heritage not being a constraint, but an invitation to excel, is something that we try. I know there are a couple of people are late. I didn't want to. But the invitation to excel is really important because part of what we are trying to do all the time here in World Heritage in Bath is invite people to do everything that they can in the city to the very best of their resources, their very best of their intention, and try to excel. And so we come on to that World Heritage symbol. And reading it, you can see that the square represents human skill and inspiration. whilst the circle wraps around the outside, representing nature. And in the main, the first 4 talks we had were really about human skill and inspiration. Today's talk is a bridge, if you will, between that and the next talk, which is about the landscape setting. And I'll say a few more words about that later on. But what we ask you to do is to keep your eye open. Look for the symbol. Look for the World Heritage symbol wherever you travel by World Heritage sites. Most tour company itineraries around the world actually move their people around by World Heritage sites. And we have various emblems in the city. If you go into the Roman baths, for example, there's a huge 8-foot diameter one above the reception desk. There's also one at floor level in the doormat, which seems to me to be a little strange, but at least you have to look down at it as you walk over it. And there are plenty more on the roads into Bath. You should see them as you come into the city. It's a really important symbol because of the places that attract it around the world. And the thing that UNESCO describes that as being places of outstanding universal value to the whole of humanity. And you can see, I'm not going to go through them, you can see the 3 on the outside are from around the world, and no one could dispute that they were of outstanding universal value. And the one, of course, on the corner represents us here in Bath. And Bath was the 6th World Heritage Site in the UK, in the same year as Westminster Abbey, and the year before the Tower of London. And that, I hope, gives you some idea that in 1987, Bath was seen as an exemplar in World Heritage terms. And indeed, when we got our second inscription in 2021 for being part of the Great Spa Towns of Europe, we became one of only 22 double inscribed sites around the world. And as you can see, for those of you looking on the screen at home, there are 1,157 World Heritage Sites, of which only 22 are double inscribed, and Bath is one of those 22. So really, really important. And when you look at this slide, you might wonder why that red line exists. And that red line is the limit of Bath's council area when it had its own council in 1987. And so everything inside the red line is the World Heritage Site. And the great thing about our World Heritage Site is that in common with every other World Heritage Site, all 1,157 World Heritage Sites have to have at least one attribute of outstanding universal value. Many have 2, some have 3, Bath has 6. And the 6 you can see are on the left-hand side. Those in capital letters represent the 4 that we've seen already. The one coloured red is this evening, and then next week we have the green setting of the city. And you can see a visual image now on the screen of all 6 of those. On the top left, you can see the head of the god, the Roman god Sulis Minerva, which has a gilded finish. It was found in Stall Street when they were digging a sewer trench in 1727. Then you can come across and see the Royal Crescent, which of course fits with Georgian architecture. The Royal Crescent, built in 1760s as the first crescent shape building in the country at the time. Moving across to the top right, you can see the plan of Bath in the 1700s and towards the middle of 1700s. And that shows you Georgian town planning, which went on to travel around the world in the way in which cities can be laid out. And then in the middle, last week's talk was about the hot springs. And on the far right-hand side, you can see next week's talk, which is going to be about the green countryside setting of the city. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a contemporary engraving, which gives some idea about the social ambition in the city. Now, normally at this point, I might mention one or two little catchphrases, but I'm going to save all of those for Elaine. And if Elaine doesn't mention them for whatever reason, you can come and knock on my door and I'll give you a clue too. But I don't want to steal any of Elaine's thunder. What I do want to do is to quickly give you an idea about some of the stuff that the World Heritage Enhancement Fund, which is special to Bath, set up in Bath, and that's what I'm going to very quickly whip through. And I do mean quickly, not in any great detail, but it is important because this is putting World Heritage in action. So the fund was set up in 2009, and you can see the reason for it. All of the things that we do are relatively low cost, £10,000 downwards. And it's really difficult for a busy council, and a council that has very little surplus money, to focus on those many smaller items, as I'll show you, that we have been doing. And when I say they're cash-strapped, more than 84% of the council's budget this year is going on social care. That leaves less than 16% of their budget to fund everything else, from the public realm to collecting rubbish and waste from your dustbins, to employing staff, to looking after the buildings like the Guildhall and others that they own and operate. So it's a really difficult challenge. So the fund fits in very nicely. And before 2009, the Bath Preservation Trust, in those days, did a lot of renovation works themselves. They actually acquired cottages or buildings, small buildings, which were in danger of being pulled down. They renovated them and sold them on. And that was a way that the Preservation Trust gathered money together to fund its other activities, which of course these days manifests itself in 4 museums and a lot of planning and conservation work. There's some words up there about David Beaton. Now, I'm guessing that David isn't in the audience this evening, but David came to Bath having worked in and around the historic royal palaces, and he was an inspirational leader. And if you know David, I hope you'll pass this on, because there's a large number of people who've got a huge amount of respect for David, because this is the way in which the actual World Heritage Enhancement Fund came about. Was somebody had an idea that the Preservation Trust and the council really wanted to move away, get somebody to do it other than them, because it was proving problematic. And he went to an interview because he was a trustee of the Preservation Trust at the time. And he went to an interview with 2 council directors, heads of department. And he was absolutely adamant that, as I've put on the screen, the fund must make a difference and it must operate independently. And the one thing he said it mustn't be is a talking shop. It's going to be action. We're going to do stuff. And actually, strangely, those 2 directors were so impressed by his energy, his enthusiasm, and his inspiration that they both agreed to take £10,000 out of their then council budget in order to set the fund up as a starting income on an annual basis. So all credit to David for getting us going. And when you look at some of the detail, you don't need to get involved in the details, save to say that the 3 parties to this memorandum of understanding are the council, BPT, which is the Bath Preservation Trust, and the World Heritage Site Advisory Board, which I chair. And each of those organisations has 3 members who sit on a management committee who look at all of the projects that the working group recommends. And I'm going to show you a few of those as we go through a couple more slides, so that there is due diligence about whether these projects should go ahead and the money should be spent. We have a working group of about 8 or 9 people from around the city who all have different interests in making World Heritage and projects work. And we have a part-time administrator funded by the Preservation Trust. And importantly, it's all about stuff that's in the public realm out there, not privately owned property. When the fund was set up all those years ago, 2009, you could get some grants for working on listed buildings. They're very, very few and far between now. On the right-hand side, you can see a lantern which is hanging over Walcott Steps. Now, many of you will know of Walcott Steps, which until relatively recently was known as a drug exchange because of the nightclubs that are nearby. And so we've spent just over £11,000 renovating it. We've tidied up the steps, repointed some of the steps. We've repointed the entrances at both ends. We've made it look much more attractive. We've taken, none of the street lighting was working. And so we've taken away the modern looking lights and we've replaced them with period lights, which actually, interestingly, don't have any glass in them, so they can't throw stones at it and break the light. And now, as far as we're aware, it is no longer a drug exchange because the lights are on throughout the evening. So that's a definite benefit to the city. And this is what we're said that we have to do. And I'll leave you to read those while I say a few words about the Sydney buildings. And there's a volunteer we have up in Sydney buildings called Steve Kearse. I don't know if Steve's here this evening. A just amazing character. He decided that because Bath has a long history in being one of the early cities to have electric lighting, which in Bath's case was somewhere around 1910 when these lanterns were put up. They were taken down and generally scrapped in the 1960s. Just one of the tops, which is called a cast crown lantern, just one of them was saved. And the task that Steve undertook was, we need to bring these back. There are a series of lanterns now all the way along Sydney buildings, and he needed to find somebody who could cast them. And he kept going into iron foundries as he travelled around the country doing other things, and eventually, just outside Manchester, found a lovely little iron foundry who agreed to cast them. And so we've helped fund the 12 lanterns that now exist all the way along Sydney buildings. And they've now got LED lighting in them, specially adapted so that, again, you'll notice there's no glass and the LED lighting will last a long time before it needs a renewal. Here you can see the three aims of the fund looking easy to read. And on the right-hand side, you can see something, if you can read it clearly enough, in the middle it says the Turnpike Trust from 1835. Now, Turnpike Trusts are an amazing thing. Many people would call these milestones, but most of them around Bath that you see are trust markers from the turnpikes. And there were 10 local acts like an Act of Parliament from 1707 to 1878, creating the 9 turnpike roads which came into Bath. There's an organisation called the Turnpike Society, and they believed that there are at least 39 of these markers still in existence, and 51, they reckon, have existed in the past. Well, a few years ago, we found 19 of them, and we restored 19 of them for a cost of just over £3,700. And we've instituted now what we are calling a quinquennial review, reviewing our projects from more than 5 years ago, and we are about to start to redo some of the restoration works that we did on them, because we genuinely believe they're an important artifact of our city. And so as you move on, here's some of the stuff that the fund actually does. We've so far, since 2009, taken on 69 projects right across the World Heritage Site, not just here in the centre, but out within our World Heritage Red Line boundary. and you can see the amount of money we have spent. There's in addition some interpretation projects, that is helping people to understand why something is here and what its purpose was. And then there's been 11 phases of what we call the milestones and street signs project. So the milestones, of course, are those turnpike trust markers. And I'm going to say just a couple of words about the street signs in a moment. And then we've got 8 ongoing projects at the moment. And in total, that's adding up all of those together, just over £393,000 have been spent on those 69 plus 7 plus 11 phases plus another 8. So a lot has gone on. And one of the projects that we worked on was the Nelson Trail. We're very keen on trails because trails around the city help to move some of our tourists and locals out of the city centre to make it less crowded. When you think that in the last figures that we know about, 6.25 million people came to the city in the last year before the pandemic. Now you can imagine that's why the city gets so busy. And there's now a whole group of trails being put together on a website, which we're working with the Persuasion Trust. They're going to host it. And I don't know if Fiona's in the audience. Is Fiona here? Good for you, Fiona. Fiona, I have to tell you, is brilliant. Absolutely. She's got more fingers in more heritage pies than almost anybody. But she came up with this tremendous idea of collecting all these different trails together. And I think we've now discovered something over 30 trails, ranging from everything from looking at the Bath Stone to looking at around the city centre at the big attractions, to looking at trees, to looking at the Skyline Walk, and of course to Nelson. And Nelson's Trail came about because the World Heritage team were thinking about expanding our city trail. And I happen to know somebody who was involved with the Nelson Society. We got together with the Nelson Society and they were delighted because Nelson has a lot of contacts here. It had a lot of contacts here in Bath. We ended up with something over 30 different locations where we could have talked about Nelson's involvement, but actually we ended up with just 18, and that takes about an hour and a half to walk round. We had, with the help of the Nelson Society, who helped fund it all, we had 20,000 of those leaflets with the map inside, printed in 2019 and 2018, and all of those 20,000 went. We had another 5,000 produced, and we do still have some of those because we believe we want to get all the things like that post-pandemic onto the internet. But as you can see, all that stuff, hugely successful. And this is where the money comes from. You can see on the screen the different locations, the different organizations that give us some money. And this particular map that I've featured is a tremendous map. If you're interested in what the city looked like and what was where in the Georgian era, then it's available from the Bath Preservation from their shop at number 1 Royal Crescent. It's sometimes available here when they have stock. It's not expensive, but it is absolutely fascinating. And the History of Bath Group are working now to improve that map by getting a layer of Roman locations inserted into the map, and then a layer of the medieval locations inserted into the map. And if you were here for the first lecture by Peter Davenport, Peter has been doing a lot of the work getting the Roman information in. And so we've had in total, we've given to us just over £440,000 since 2009. And now lastly, just two quick projects, because I think both of them are of interest, they're easy to see. This is a Watchman's Sentry Box, and we wrote, two of us, Melanie Smith-Giles and myself, researched and wrote a paper on the Watchman's Sentry Box in Norfolk Crescent. There's loads of fascinating information. It's available online, but even more than that, you don't actually need to go online because it's in It's now been reproduced in this month's Bath magazine. Now, the editor, Emma, was going to be here this evening. Are you here, Emma? I can't see you. No, she's not here, but she kindly picked this up and thought it would be great. So it's a 2-page spread inside the Bath magazine in the May edition. As it says at the bottom there, it is a rare and important structure. It is the only circular one left in Bath, and as far as we know, could be in the whole of England. And there are 2 others in Bath that were sentry boxes, but without a door on, and they are at the front of the Holborn Museum. Now, they're much more like simply guarding the Holborn, what was the Holborn House and the hotel before that. But this was actually on the corner of Norfolk Crescent, and it is beautiful. And you can see there's 2 numbers in the corner of the photograph. That's because actually the Watchman's Sentry Box was our first project in 2009. We took it looking like a complete ruin and restored it. And then in the past 6 months, we've actually just restored the bits that needed attention. So we then go on to, here's a sketch by George Cruikshank. Now, a Charlie in those days, in 1820, a Charlie was a watchman. And here you can see it says, Tom getting the best of a Charlie. And it was not uncommon, actually, for watchmen's boxes to be overturned. So you can't really imagine that getting overturned. But those that were made of wood, obviously, were much more prone to that kind of thing. And then lastly, we have our street signs project. And I urge you to look at the numbers here. You know, we have restored 66 signs since 2010, when we began this part of the project. We've spent just over 60,000 on them. So you can see they cost almost £1,000 on average to restore. Some of them are inscribed in the stone. Some of them are in paint. And I can tell you the painted ones cost almost as much as the stone re-inscriptions are. And of course, that is an average over the last 23 years. So these days, I can assure you, they're costing nearly £2,000 a piece to restore. And Tim Beale, who was then working at the Preservation Trust, is a great photographer, and he kindly put together this montage of a whole list of the different ones that we had restored. And we used that as part of our submission when we won the Georgians Group's National Award in 2019 for improving the public realm. And as at the top, you see this natty little phrase of restoring the chisel marks of the architects and builders of the 18th century who really understood the importance of street signage. You may have heard me say this before, but one of the things that I think is probably true is the reason why the street signs in Bath are at first floor level is that if you were rich enough to come to Bath in the 1700s and 1800s, you probably came in your own carriage and you didn't need to know what the roads were called to find your way. But the coachman sitting on top of your coach driving the horses did need to know. And perhaps that is why the signs are generally at first floor level. And then finally, I just wanted to take the opportunity to say a really big thank you to the people who've helped make this work. From David Beaton onwards, we've got our funders, the council and the Preservation Trust. And we've got all those other partners that we work with. Then there's the various craftspeople, and they're just brilliant. If you ever look at, next time you walk, for example, into the middle of Queen Square, look at the base of the obelisk. We restored that last year, and you won't be able to tell the difference. It's just amazing. We have a group of volunteers doing different bits and pieces as well, which cuts down cost and time. And of course, we have Ainsley, who isn't here. I don't think Ainsley's here this evening. I embarrassed her once before, so I think she probably decided not to come this evening because she thought I might do it again. And I will name Ainsley. And if you're listening online, Ainsley, please blush now, because this round of applause is definitely for you and all our other people. So please do give a great round of applause to say thank you. So now we come on to the really good stuff. And we will take those questions, as I said, we're going to do it after Elaine's talk. And trying to write an introduction to Elaine, whom I met on Twitter, interestingly, several years ago, and then latched onto her when I realized we needed someone to talk about. It's something that Elaine is absolutely expert at. And it won't go unnoticed that this is a photograph from the BBC when Elaine was working on one particular program. And you can see on the left-hand side the great stuff that she has done. And it's fantastic that she was here in Bath, and now she's escalated up those heights to be a professor of English history here or up in Liverpool. So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome back into our city to Elaine Chalus.
Right, can people hear me? Can everyone hear me at the back? That's great. Thank you very much, Barry. That was really lovely and fascinating to hear about all the projects that have been going on as well. Bath has got a very special place in my mind, in my history, in my research, and also in my work experience. And because one of the first places I worked as a permanent academic was here in Bath. And the history of 18th century Bath has always fascinated me. It's a very exciting place. So I was very pleased to be invited to give this talk. I'm not talking specifically about ambitions. I'm trying to talk a little bit more broadly. And I thought it'd be an interesting way to think around 18th century Bath and what was going on there. And one of the places to start, let me just make sure this is going to move forward. There we go. Should move forward now. Yeah. One of the places to start, of course, is with someone like Jane Austen, who we all know and who we treasure for the time that she spent in Bath. And here she is in Persuasion, writing, and she's saying, our cousins, this is Anne Elliot, and the Elliots in Persuasion, our cousins in Laura Place, our cousin, Lady Dalrymple and Miss Carteret, were talked of to everybody. Lady Russell confessed that she had expected something better, but yet it was an acquaintance worth having. Anne smiled and said, my idea of good company is the company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal of conversation. That is what I call good company. And this, of course, is published in 1817, but she's talking about a time period, exactly in the time period that we're thinking of, that towards the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. So wrote Jane Austen in Persuasion, capturing that desperate sycophancy of the Baronet Sir Walter Elliot and of his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, on the one hand, and also then of the more measured social calculation of the widowed Lady Russell on the other, who says, well, maybe they're not what we wanted, but they're valuable. We can use them in some way. We want that kind of social ambition. While Austen's satirical pen mocked displays of social ambition of this sort, and she had undoubtedly experienced similar situations during her time in Bath, it did happen, definitely, it would be historically incorrect, actually, I think, to assume that this sort of toadying was uppermost in society in 18th century Bath. Bath's residents and the visiting company may well have socialized with purpose, and that's what I'm talking about tonight, in a sense, socializing with purpose. But their purposes, like the company itself, were widely varied. Very, very different often looking at different communities entirely, different sets of interests. Not everyone would have defined good company in exactly the same way as Austen. And I have to say, I'm not talking about some of the good company that would have been found on Avon Street among the ladies of the night tonight, or perhaps in the gambling dens that some of the young rakes like young Tom would have been involved in. But I think we'll touch on quite a number of the different kinds of good company. One of the reasons that I think, and one of the things I want to point out tonight, is that one of the reasons that Bath was such a draw in the 18th century, for 18th century contemporaries, was because it was so diverse. It offered the perspective of good company and a great deal of conversation, whether it was in-person conversation or conversation that you sent out to the provinces or to London through your letters, through the kind of gossipy news that you were spreading around. It meant this to a great many people, however defined. Now, I don't know how much of the background of 18th century Bath you've had over the course of the past lectures, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on that, but I do want to say a little bit about it, just to give you a shape about the kind of way that we're looking at a town that's growing. Suffice it to say that Bath at the beginning of the 18th century is a relatively small, faltering, it's quite underdeveloped little town. It's very poorly accessible. Those turnpike roads aren't there yet, and consequently getting in and out of Bath, unless the roads are dry, can be a real trick. Getting Queen Anne into Bath, for instance, was a really bad time when the weather was bad in the turn of the 18th century. And it took quite a bit to turn that small town of about 3,000 people, the end of the 17th century, by fits and starts into that busy, market-aware, upmarket health and leisure center, the queen of the spas, that it is, a genteel residential town attracting tens of thousands of visitors by the beginning of the 19th century. And with a population, a resident population, that's basically 10 times as large as its beginning of the 18th century population. So it's growing rapidly, if unevenly. And what I want to do now, before I go on to look at some of the places and things and people and how they responded to 18th century Bath, is to try and put some of that into a bit more context for you. Think about some of the key factors that combined to make Bath so ideally situated to thrive in the 18th century, and factors that contributed to the development of the culture of the spa. So the key thing I want to be able to emphasize here is that Bath is ideally situated at the beginning of the 18th century and through the 18th century to develop and to thrive, to become that queen of the spas. It's socially situated, culturally, economically, chronologically, and geographically situated. Socially, it's a society that's in change, it's in transition. We're moving from a society of ranks and orders to one where you're seeing the emergence of the professions, we're seeing the development of a plutocracy as the city rises, as the empire brings money back home, and we're seeing the rise of an increasingly confident and important social and culturally middle-class group, a middling sort group, if we wish. Now, birth and rank, of course, did still matter at this point in time. You need only to think of the lists of Bath arrived here that we see in the newspapers for Bath every week to be able to confirm this. Because, of course, those newspapers listed the weekly elite arrivals, the top echelon of the company in descending social order, beginning, of course, with those of the highest title. Not everyone is mentioned, ever. And toadying the elite in the way that Jane Austen mentions, the Elliot's doing, could also still, of course, bring its benefits in terms of social or cultural patronage, political patronage. It could give you access to places, if you talk to the right people, maybe talk to someone, a politician, about a pension, looking for who was coming into town and was there a family that had a daughter of the right age, a son of the right age. All of these kinds of things socially were important. And increasingly, of course, this is a time period when performative displays of behavior, manners, taste, fashion, knowledge of art, knowledge of music, knowledge of literature, all of these things came to be seen as the marks, the defining marks of gentlemen and ladies. Now, of course, that opens up all kinds of difficulties and possibilities for mistaking someone who is an adventurer as a gentleman or an adventuress as a lady. And Jane Austen, of course, plays with this, and so do other writers. But it is very much the changing nature of society. So socially, Bath emerges as right that correct point in time. It's a socially ambitious society. It's driven by notions of improvement, whether it's improving the architecture, whether it's improving yourself, whether it's improving your social status. All of these are here. New money, of course, is emerging. It's still often seen as vulgar and a bit too gaudy, a bit too prone to display, but it's there. So socially, we've got a very interesting society. It's a moment that we capture. Culturally as well, we're looking at a cultural period where we are benefiting from the kind of information that's coming back to us from the Grand Tour. We're seeing the development of a professional cultural sector with professional artists, professional actors, professional writers, and the growth of a variety of often commercialized venues of activity that will allow people to display their products or perform their products, for instance, like music halls, concert rooms, reading rooms, libraries, galleries. All of these things are emerging, and they're emerging specifically for a mixed sex audience as we see more and more women moving into more public arenas of society, and where socializing can take place in public. So this importance of the social and the public are really things that we're going to emphasize. Economically, of course, we've got a rising standard of living. For at least the first 3/4 of the 18th century, people have more money in their pockets, more disposable money. And that's really useful for a place like Bath, where you're seeing a development of a commercial sector that is really upmarket, often right at the very top, very fast changing fashions, very elite goods, things that can be very expensive, but also some lower price copies so that even people lower down the social scale can buy things. So we're getting the development at this point in time of a highly commercial, consumer-driven society and a proliferation of consumer goods. And in conjunction with that, we're also seeing a very progressive mindset. There's an entrepreneurial mindset among the 18th century investors, 18th century people who've made money. And they're taking advantage of new developments, financial developments that allow them to do things like take out mortgages. And that, of course, facilitates the development and the investment in property. And Bath also benefits from that because, as R.S. Neal pointed out years ago in his writing and his research on Bath, Bath benefited to the extent of about £3 million in terms of house building with a capital value of about £3 million from the kinds of investment that were there. And of course, this also comes into conjunction with the increasing taste for classical architecture. So we have the kind of classical taste that's being developed at the same time. So chronologically, all of this is coming together. It's coming together at the time that we get the rise of the town. And so it's that combination of the investors working with an ambitious corporation here in the town, literally reshaping the city, the town over the course of the century, adapting it to meet the social demands of this visiting public and a growing residential public, but also the tastes of the era. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. It's important to think that Bath, too, was only about 100 miles from London. And while access was dire at the beginning of the century, it's changed very rapidly. And I think, Barry's point, very, very well made about the turnpikes. If we're thinking that one of the big turning points for Bath is the arrival of Queen Anne in 1703, that period there, it's only about 4 years later that first turnpike is built. And by the time that we end up at the end, by the 1770s, basically all of Britain is turnpiked. And we will see turnpikes developing that give us huge improvements in transportation and communication. The Great Bath Road, the famous route from London to Bath, was basically fully turnpike by about the 1740s, and travel times as a result plummeted. Anyone who wanted to spare their horses could take the Bath flying coach and be in town, middle of the century, in less than 24 hours. And that's pretty good at the point in time. By the 1790s, however, that time had come down to about 10 hours. So you could really come back and forth to Bath very, very quickly indeed. And as Graham Davis pointed out a number of years ago in one of his publications, the number of weekly services, coach services, from London to Bath, well, nowadays it simply would make you envious. It skyrockets. There were already 30 to 40 different coach services operating by mid-18th century, and up to 147 weekly coach services by 1800. Think about trying to get your National Express coach today. Now, that's sort of to give you some context, but I also want to give you a little bit of information about a few key concepts which are really central to understanding Bath in the 18th century before I move on to some people. And the first one is really, in terms of looking at this, it's this concept of politeness. And now that's not just manners. Politeness is a key word for understanding the meaning of the 18th century and the way that society operated. And I think this is really significant given what Barry was saying about UNESCO and its building peace and through, in a sense, through cooperation, because politeness is really about the art of pleasing in company and in conversation. As Abel Boyer said, a dexterous management of our words and action, wherein we make other people have a better opinion of us and of themselves. It was an ideal concept for a newly developing urban society where people who didn't necessarily come from the same class, the same background, even the same location, had to learn to rub along with each other, had to get along, where the new commercial people had to find a way to make sure that they could cater to their public, to their consumers. And politeness was defined by simplicity, moderation, mutual tolerance, and the overriding importance of courtesy and considerate behavior. It emphasized worldly sociability and agreeableness. And this is really important for Bath because all of those things are crucial to the way Bath is developed. And what's more important even than that is it could be taught. Although natural politeness was deemed to be something that came with high birth, you could also teach politeness. And so it becomes something that can be acquired through education. It is a demonstration of visual and fashion-conscious display of gentility through behavior, conversation, and taste. And this is absolutely the kind of thing that Bonash, when he's setting up the rules for the pump room and the assemblies, is trying to instill. And we see it right instilled in Bath in itself. And of course, we get that with a variation of impacts, and we see it in behaviors, we see it in manners, we see it in comportment. We see it also, we also see it in a variety of different venues of commercialized leisure, where people that cater to the polite, to the groups that are polite, are increasingly being supported. So we see it in coffee houses, clubs, pleasure gardens, theaters, concerts, so on. These are all mixed sex often, except for the coffee houses, which tended to be male. But most of these are mixed sex organizations or institutions where socializing is done in public, where this kind of polite mixing has to take place. Now, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be ambitious and that it couldn't be competitive, and it often was both, especially around fashion, okay? But it was meant to be polite, and usually, according to in Bath, it was polite as well. Now, I've mentioned sociability just in passing, and sociability is another key concept for this period. And Joseph Addison, writing in The Spectator in 1711, offered us a precise, refined definition of sociability. I'm not going to read all of it, but he says man is a sociable animal. And I think that again is entrenched here in Bath. Man is a sociable animal. We get on together. And if you look at the bottom of that quotation, he says, when men are thus knit together by love of society, and he's saying men, but I would say men and women as well, not a spirit of faction, and do not meet to censure or annoy those that are absent, but to enjoy one another, when they are thus combined for their own improvement or the good of others, or at least to relax themselves from the business of the day by an innocent and cheerful conversation, there may be something very useful in these little institutions and establishments. And again, Bath underlines the importance of conversation, cheerful conversation, convivial conversation. By the end of the century, politeness is fading, and it's being replaced by something that we call sensibility. And sensibility fits in with nerve theory and the senses, the feelings, and it emphasizes feelings and sympathy. And it's very important for thinking about the development as we move from politeness through to the Gothic. And I've simply included this here, not because sensibility is desperately important for Bath, but because sensibility features in Bath. We have people like Miss Sophia Lee, of course, who is one of the famous Lees of the Lees Sisters School up at Belvedere. But she was, before that, a Gothic writer, and she wrote a novel that allowed her to invest the money she earned into starting her school. We have Jane Austen, of course, Northanger Abbey, which plays with the notion of the Gothic. We have also, we've got Mary Shelley and Anne Radcliffe, two Gothic writers, both of whom have very close links to Bath. Anne Radcliffe, whose parents ran Wedgwood's, what we would call he would have called a warehouse, but it was basically a store on the street here on Pulteney Street, sorry, not on Pulteney Street, on Milsom Street, and Mary Shelley, who was, of course, living in Bath, writing up Frankenstein at the turn of the 19th century. So this kind of development gives us a sense of where we're coming from. The last point I want to pick up on, and this again picks up on, I'm sure, what you've heard already with some of the work about the development of the town itself and the buildings and the architecture, is the notion of the urban Renaissance. And this is work that has been done, of course, in history by the late and much lamented Professor Peter Borsay, who wrote much on 18th century Bath. And effectively what we have is between about 1660 and 1760, there is an urban Renaissance in England, and Bath is a prime example of this. The streets are cleaned, they're widened, old buildings are removed, roads are straightened, overhead signs are removed, and we get the signs built into the sides of buildings, exactly as Barry was talking. New areas are planned carefully, grid planned often and built, and there's emphasis on stylistic unity, often with reference to classical architecture. So this is the making of Bath, is very much this kind of urban Renaissance, and Bath becomes central to starting that. And of course, also the provision of fashionable public leisure. So this combination of factors that we've got lays the groundwork for a spa culture to develop that was both performative and public. It was sociable, it was gossipy, it was personally ambitious, it was often judgmental and sometimes very cliquey, but it could also be highly politically aware. Now, it's important to remember, though, that the thing that actually brings people to Bath in the beginning tends to be the waters. And it's the waters that are going to bring the early royals and the early visitors to Bath throughout time. But it's also specifically going to be after the visits of Queen Anne, turn of the 18th century, and then combining that with the inspired leadership of people like Richard Bonash and the activities of the corporation, the contributions of the individual entrepreneurs and investors that really sets Bath on the road to success. Queen Anne's sojourns in Bath at the beginning of the century were really important because they brought not only her, but they brought her court to Bath. They brought the courtiers with, and they offered the elite a place to come to get much less formal access to the Queen and her court, to ask for patronage, to try and create connections, to look for social advantage, perhaps to get pensions or places, sinecures, and of course also to come and start looking for advantageous marriages for their children. So all of that comes in at a point where even the court is socializing in public. It's an opportunity to access a more informal and more intimate setting. And royal visitors always had cachet. There are lots of royal visitors to Bath, and there were plenty of them throughout the century. And I'm just going to pick out two. One is in 1761, when George III's younger son, the Duke of York, comes. Now, his entrance into Bath didn't rival the guard of honor that met Queen Anne. She was met supposedly by grenadiers, 200 virgins, richly attired like Amazons with bows and arrows. I've never understood how in 18th century, throughout the 18th century, they seem to find for election processions and meetings of the royals, hundreds of virgins in every small town to be able to dress coming to meet these people. However, they did meet Queen Anne. So the Duke of York doesn't get that, although he might have liked the virgins. He was warmly welcomed, though, with non-stop ringing of church bells, the firing of guns, and an obsequious, of course, formal visit from the mayor, the aldermen, and the common councilmen. He, in turn, though, performed his part well. He promptly opened a ball at Wiltshire's room, and he danced the first minuets with the current belle of Bath, a Miss St. Quintin. And he then, in the evening, after the minuets were finished, danced a country dance with the daughter of an important political family, a Miss Lowther, who was visiting Bath at the time. He gave the company plenty of opportunities to see him as well. He commanded a play at the Orchard Street Theatre, a concert at Wiltshire's Rooms on another day. He attended the Abbey Church on Sunday and took all his male retinue with him, very nicely dressed, they said. And he held 2 levees a week while he was in town. Now, for elite men, now particularly this would be for men, who were seeking patronage or who wanted to forge connections to the Duke and preferably maybe even get the ear of the king, this was really important. So trying to use that space as a way to connect and to forward your own ambition for whatever it happened to be was one of the things that would have been doing. But there were also, of course, plenty of gawkers who simply wanted to be around to say that they had seen him or they'd been in his presence. And as I put up on this picture here, this is not unusual. Even in 1790, well, sorry, this is much later than that. This is the Queen Charlotte's last visit to Bath to take the waters. About a year and a bit before she dies, and she's being portrayed there as looking very ill, looking very frail, thin, sitting in a chair to take her drink of water. But on the side of it, we're seeing the groups of gawkers in the back who are standing on the tables so that they can actually see her. And the comments say things like, well, I declare, I see nothing extraordinary at all. And on the other side, you've got a couple saying, presumably Irish, because of the way that they're trying to write the thing, why, Sean, she don't look a bit better than old Granny. Who said she did, eh, Dame? And this kind of notion of being able to look for, you want to see these people. And this was important. So that's the kind of thing that we've got as a basis. And it is, of course, in the pump room that we're seeing this. And it was at the pump room where people gathered to take the waters, converse, listen to the band, have a stroll, meet friends, make acquaintances, where new arrivals came to sign in, and they were often very carefully scrutinized. This is a society that valued self-interested alertness. So the arrival of a clergyman who was looking ill would immediately send someone off to write a letter to someone who's got the possibility of getting so-and-so clergyman's place because he looks like he's going to die. And of course, sometimes they did. That's also why they read the newspapers, because there was always a who died in that. But it might also be that some politician had arrived. Okay, so does that mean that there's new maneuvering going on? Is there something going on? Have they left London for a reason? Is there a possibility of getting patronage? There's a new young woman in town. She's an heiress. We know how much money she has because this kind of thing was eagerly circulated publicly. Or there's a new young man who's just come in. He's just inherited his title. Every mother on the make is going to be looking at him. So appearing at the pump room was a way to be on display, but it was also a place to gather news and spread it around. It could be rather daunting as the young, as the young Earl of Orrery, Earl of Cork and Orrery's the fifth Earl, found out on his first appearance to the pump room after he succeeded to the title in 1731. He's about 24 at this point in time. He's just succeeded maybe a couple of months before about that. And he says here, I set forth early, this is the first morning that he comes into Bath, he's just arrived, darted myself immediately into the pump room. As soon as the circling whisper had taken air, he walked in, the whisper's gone around. The Earl of Orrery was present, all eyes fixed on me. Observe of how great importance the death of one man, his father, is to the life of another. Some months ago, I should have been as little regarded as my own natural shyness could desire. But now I had seats and salutes and innumerable civilities offered to me from every quarter. All of these I repaid with a solemnity of face that at once shades and adorns an English senator. And then, flying from the center of all polite conversation to the asylum of all polite literature, I entered the palatinate of Mr. Leake, the bookseller. And he is quite a shy chap at this point in time. And so it's not surprising that he heads off to the bookseller where he can hide off and look at books instead. Now, Lord Orrery, of course, is not the only visitor to Bath who found solace in Mr. Leake's or in any of the other circulating libraries in Bath. Society in Bath, from the early days of Beau Nash onward, had placed heavy emphasis on communal mixed-sex socializing in public, but there were also lots of people who tried to avoid that whenever possible and socialized in small groups, sometimes increasingly in private homes, but often in the booksellers or in what we would think of as cafes or coffee shops, or in small coteries. In the public gardens or places where they could meet and just be by themselves. Polite society in Bath was at least theoretically relatively inclusive. And it was sustained by the intermingling of groups. It was the metropolitan elite, the rural cousins, the nobles with the gentry, the merchants and the professionals. So you get some mixing, some breaking down of the ranks. Bath was sociable, and I just really wanted to just point out here a few things. This kind of mixing could have social and political benefits, and of course Bath was one of England's leading marriage markets. Now, we've got here, just as a brief bit, you've got the tokens for entry to Spring Gardens. You've got at the bottom left there, you've got beaux meeting on Bond Street, basically just that mixing and mingling of young men and women and the horses going around. You can almost smell and hear the noise. You've got the terraced walks where you would have the elites taking the air, Wiltshire's rooms, Simpson's rooms, the various assembly rooms that we can go to, trade cards, things that you might want to do to go shopping or to go and look at things. And of course, on the bottom, the libraries. So you've got a whole series of possible places where you can meet, fashionable lodgings, which you might be renting and using domestic spaces to be able to offer your own visits and teas. You might offer dinners to friends or even put on stylish evening entertainments. For those who were seeking a spouse, of course, for those young girls who were in fashionable schools in Bath, or for parents who are preparing their children for the London season and the entry to London season. There were also, of course, carefully chaperoned balls where presumably or supposedly the master of ceremonies would be sort of being careful to make sure that people weren't introduced to the wrong people. This one, of course, is satirical. But we also have places where you might also meet. So subscription concerts, for instance, here, like this one that's being held, or later on in this century, the catch clubs, which became really popular for glees and various other pieces of music. So you've got a whole range of places where people might meet. The key, though, to this, if you were looking at the marriage market side of Bath, is that it was performative. Young people who were on show had to perform, and they were judged on how they performed. This was specifically true, of course, at the assembly rooms and the balls. If you were one of the ones leading the ball, doing a minuet at the start of the balls, that was, for the beginning 3/4 of the century, pretty much, a one couple at a time event. So a young girl performing the dances would be judged on her steps, her tournure, everything that she did would be judged there. And it would be quite stressful, as Rachel Bynott's recent work has shown. Now, other places that you might want to go, or you might not for that matter, would be to some of the people who were the queens of the city, who were inviting people in to create exclusive sets. And one of these was Lady Miller. And Lady Miller is Anna Lady Miller, who has a villa at Bath Easton and who ran for several decades during the Bath season from November to May. Alternate Thursdays, she would have people invited specifically to do anonymous pieces of poetry, which were then popped into this wonderful little urn that was decorated, presumably most of the time, with pink ribbons and myrtles. And a winning prize or a winning poem would be chosen from this, and the poems then later were published, the proceeds given to charity. Now, Anna Miller met with various responses from people who visited her. Some people said she was a frowsy middle-aged lady who looked rather vulgar and was overdressed. Other people were quite impressed with her. But an invitation to Lady Miller's was not something you turned down. And here's teenaged Harriet Pitt writing to her mother, Lady Chatham, in 1779, saying that this isn't something that particularly appeals to her, but they can't get out of going. And she's saying she's specifically unimpressed because Lady Miller only receives on a Thursday, and it's a ball night, and it takes a long time to get ready for a ball. So she's off to go to do Lady Miller's, but she's saying that Mr. Grenville goes with us, and he has promised us, in consideration of a great deal of companies dining here today, and of course at the ball later in the evening, to return about 1 o'clock. So they've got time to get the hairdressers in and to get their clothes ready and to go out for the evening. And she then goes on to say something about who was at the party, and she's listing all the people that go there. And she's then shifting off away from that to say, we've got a very good cotillion set tonight. The ball's going to be fun. At the very end, of course, a little bit of political gossip to pass on to her mother. You know, what's going on in Cheshire? And she passes that on as well. Another woman, slightly later in time, who arguably was the Queen of Bath, is maybe Mrs. Alicia Macartney. And I'm quoting here Barbara White, who wrote on who was the Queen of Bath. And she says, she was neither civil nor good-natured. She contrived to get company to her mansion and to be countenanced by people of character and rank. But Lady Miller could do it at least. She had some appeal. Mrs. Macartney managed it largely by usury, blackmail, and the selling of information. She was not in the slightest bit upset at pushing buttons and actually trying to shame people in the newspapers and things if they didn't come to her events. So she hosts things, she gets people there, but they're not necessarily there because they want to be there. This is not entirely surprising. You find the same kind of thing going on in London at the same time. But out of fear and retribution. So is she the Queen of Bath? It's a good question. But there were other sides of Bath as well. And we have serious side of Bath. Bath catered to many kinds of tastes, many kinds of interests. And here I've put up Reverend Penrose, who's visiting Bath in 1760, 1766, and 1767. And Reverend Penrose, as a Cornish vicar, is not in the slightest interested in assemblies. He doesn't go. He really doesn't like raking at all, doesn't like gambling, isn't interested in any of that. What he is interested in is the churches. And so he visits all the churches, he visits he goes and listens to preachers, he looks at the architecture. And as soon as he is well enough, he starts preaching in the Abbey Church. And many of the clergymen who came to Bath did exactly the same thing. They were basically brought in specifically to preach at the Abbey. But he's going off and he's having his kind of time in Bath, following his specific interests. Another chap who comes in the 1780s is John Marsh. And John Marsh is an English gentleman composer who hosts a successful subscription concert series in Salisbury, and later on runs orchestras in both Canterbury and Chichester, and runs another subscription concert series in Chichester. And he, like Penrose, found a completely different side of Bath as well. And so he says, on Saturday morning, this is immediately after he came into Bath, having introduced myself to one or two of the Pump Room band, music Pump Room, whom I met with at the music meeting in Salisbury. So he's got somebody he knew. They were so good as to play two of my manuscript overtures there, which, being very nicely played, went off very well. The next morning, having breakfasted, I went to the Octagon Chapel and played the concluding voluntary upon a charming little organ. And then the following day, he says, I had procured a letter of introduction from a friend of his to a Dr. Harrington of Bath. So on that day, he went off to go and have breakfast with Dr. Harrington. And he heard Miss Harrington play on the harpsichord, which she did in very good style. And I now began writing out an overture for two performers, which I afterwards tried out with her. And then 2 days later, he's off again. And this time he's meeting with Messrs. Grant and Roger of the Pump Room Band. And we had some quartettos together, in the course of which I tried some of my own compositions, after which I went to tea at Dr. Harrington's, where I met with another musical physician, a Dr. Woodward, and also Mr. Brett of the theatre, and a Mr. Hockley, a dancing master, and a very neat fiddle player, with whom we had some glees, and Dr. Brett and I sang. And so you've got this kind of very musical world that's going on. And the other thing, of course, we've got on the other side is we've got a very serious world, sometimes of people like Hannah Moore, who has a love-hate relationship with Bath, but lives here, has a home on Great Pulteney Street, and basically uses her socializing for evangelical purposes. And we have many different groups that gather in Bath, often meeting, first of all, in private homes. Here, like the group that is meeting at the house of Mr. Parrish in 1816, to found the Bath Female Penitentiary and later Lock Hospital, basically as a place for repentant prostitutes to be rehabilitated and then allowed to go back out into the world, presumably as prudish domestic servants. Whether that worked all the time is questionable. But that kind of serious side of Bath is very much there as well. Finally, Bath was also political, very, very political. It was an important political destination. Spa and resort towns like 18th century Bath in particular were especially well suited to the exercise of soft power or social politics, the use of social situations for political ends. And it is through the use of sociability and social situations that we see people of the court, as I said at the beginning, the administration, the opposition, and the various factions and their families coming to Bath with an ever-changing selection of independent country gentlemen and voters, where they can meet in an ostensibly social situation. Bath provides political cover, and it allows people to serve and operate and conduct political business away from the prying eyes of the court or Westminster. Oops, let's see if that's... So we've got people, for instance, here writing from Bath, saying the reason you haven't got any people here in London and you're short of politicians is because they're all here. You know, that's where they are. Or you've got somebody like Harriet Pitt, again, teenager, writing to her mum saying, the court party here say that Lord North's plan for Ireland will certainly content them, blah, blah, blah. The other side says no. And we've got Lady Harriet Pitt again, writing here on what she's picked up on the coffee tables and the tea tables as she's been out having tea. Lady Malpas told me that she hears that there will be a change of ministry after the holidays. She believes it because she hopes it. Mrs. Trevor is so glad that Wilkes has come. This is John Wilkes, the radical. And Wilkes came, he was a big draw in Bath. There were public dinners held for him almost every time he came. And he loved Bath. And he was invited to everybody's tables. So Mrs. Trevor is very pleased. And she's more violent politically than ever. And so on and so forth. Why set up in Bath? Well, the person who is the most important politician in Bath in the 18th century, of course, is William Pitt the Elder, Lord Chatham. And Lady Anson, when he's buying his place in Bath, says this is an astute choice. It's an important choice. We imagine this place will be one of those where Mr. Pitt will set up his standard and by means of the great resort of people make followers and spread his politics throughout the land. So using Bath politically. And of course, sometimes you've had the election, and once you've had the election, you have to have the election ball. And the election ball rounds off the election and puts the politeness back into society. It gets the people together, men and women, in a grand place to celebrate the outcome of the election and tries to restore peace and order. So here's an election ball from 1780, talking about our new member, Mr. Pratt, and they're meeting at Mr. Gede's rooms, most elegant entertainment, and then at 11 o'clock they were removed in chairs to the town hall, where the doors of the grand ballroom and the council chamber were thrown open, and a most magnificent scene displayed. Brilliant and numerous assemblies. Supper was plentiful, costly, and elegant in the highest degree. This is really, really important. The rooms were illuminated with hundreds of lights. Anytime you're trying to judge a ball or the success of a party in the 18th century, what you comment on is the number of lights. If it is well lit and colorfully lit, it's a success. And so here we've got it's hundreds of lamps of various hues suspended in great taste in wreaths, flowers, festoons, besides wax lights. Again, if you're judging, they've got to use wax lights. No tallow candles here, wax lights. It's more expensive, but it also gives you better light, and so on and so forth. So we've got an entire supper. There's a ball. The ladies returned to the ball. The men sat down cheerfully and drank several loyal and constitutional toasts, departing in the highest festivity and humor about 4 o'clock, 4 in the morning. Who did the ladies dance with? And so it left me quite curious. If all the men stayed to go and drink till 4 in the morning, the ladies were left to dance with somebody. But anyway, give you a sense of the kind of way that this kind of polite sociability is used even in political ends. And of course, a lot of what happened took place over tea tables. So tea table politics of various sorts, where the news is spread, like what we've already run across a few examples of, but here's another one. This is Lady Louisa Stuart, who's the Marquis of Lord Bute's daughter, writing to her aunt, and she's talking about her aunt, Lady Mary Cook, who was quite an eccentric, and also very, very political at various points in times. And here she's just spreading the news that Lady Mary, my Aunt Mary, is completely bonkers. And this is what she's up to. And she's like someone wild and possessed. She's been doing all that's necessary to raise an uproar, because it's about the outcome of the American War and whether or not peace is going to be declared. And supposedly she's out haranguing in the bookshops, lecturing the tradesmen, examining the walls for treason, and so on and so on and so forth. And so she's spreading the news. So you've got that kind of thing, but you've also got the much more sort of competitive tea table gossip of Sir George Jackson, who's writing to his mother in Bath, saying that finally his brother Francis's appointment as the plenipotentiary to Paris during the Treaty of Amiens, and that very short period when we were quasi-peace with Napoleon, it's been confirmed. You may now take your revenge, Francis says, for having so long been tongue-tied, and may talk of our mission to all your Bath tea tables to your heart's content. The reason no longer existing for the great secrecy that was for a time necessary. And Francis assures you that you may rely on receiving a lace cloak that shall be the envy by all the ladies of Bath. So that kind of tea table gossip, sociability, social ambition, they all come together in Bath. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. I said she was good. Now we're going to do some Q&A. Just takes a moment or two. We have to get Joel to get some of the microphones out. And Ian, I think he's at the back, and he's been looking at the questions online. And then we're going to take some questions in the room and some questions online and see where that leads us to. Okay, so Ian, are you okay? Ready to go? Let's have one off the online to start with, please.
Okay, thank you, Barry. So we've had a couple of questions online. The first one takes me back to memories of being an undergraduate studying the Enlightenment, because it feels like exactly the kind of question that I would have faced in a final exam. These changes in politeness, sociability, and the mixing of classes, this is a question from Trevor. The changes in politeness, sociability, and the mixing of classes sound like major changes in attitude. What was the driving force?
I've got the microphone.
I know it's.
Oh, okay. Right. Sorry. You should be able to see me now. Okay. What was the driving force for change in? The development of politeness comes in the beginning of the early 18th century, and we see it emerging in conjunction, I think, with the development of urban society as society is changing. We're looking at notions of civilizing forces, basically, and how people get along together in groups. And of course, this is the impact of the Enlightenment also, of course, has a part in this. But I think you're right in saying, yes, there are significant changes. They don't change all overnight, but there's a development that is going on over time, sort of an incremental set of changes. And the notions of civility and politeness combined are part of an ongoing process. It's not a hard and fast change by any means. We don't immediately say to people, well, you can't wear your swords here. There's no dueling. You should be saying this and you should be dressed like that. It takes a bit of time. It takes a bit of effort. And so it is an incremental process.
Thank you very much. Let's take one from in the room. I've got one down at the front here. Could you wait just for the microphone? Thank you.
It's only a comment. I can remember staffed sentry boxes in the Victoria Park estate in Manchester, so during and just after the war. So they were still in operation then, a man sitting in a box in the entry to this estate of big houses.
Yeah, that's not surprising, actually. It would be to keep them exclusive, wouldn't it, really? To keep them exclusive. Yes, absolutely.
Well, it wasn't a rough age, but they were there. Still.
Yeah. And that's very much something that this is, and I probably didn't say this clearly enough, or maybe didn't say it at all, is a lot of the kinds of social activities that are taking place are quite exclusive. The prices for entrance are often set high enough to make sure that you exclude the lower sort, and certainly the servants. They're meant for a specific middling and upwards group of society.
Thank you very much. I'll take this one over here, and then I'll come back to you in a moment or two.
There are some wonderful insights in the Journal of Edmund Rack, which was published by the BRLSI, in fact. Very amusing little journal extracts about his mixing with gentlemen. He was a Quaker, so slightly outside, really, but he was a very good fixer. And he was trying to get various societies going, quite serious scientific, scholarly societies in Bath. And it's a wonderful read and gives you a real view into this, how he mixed within this polite society, trying to summon up enthusiasm. My question actually is, how did Bath's polite society react to the kind of quite gross satirical cartoons and caricatures of Rowlandson and Gilray? Which did they join in the joke, or were they offended? Do you have any sense of how they were received?
Considering how many people bought them, I think they must have enjoyed them. I think it's sort of like political cartoons today. You know, that you've got the Steve Bell cartoon being bought by the politician who he's making fun of because in a sense it's still publicity. And this was quite a public period. So a lot of the kind of sending themselves up, sending the society up, was something that they did themselves. So you would even get people who were coming here as visitors themselves, not highfalutin artists or engravers like Cruikshanks or any of those, but people who were sketching, and they would be making cartoonish characters of the people. You did get absolutely everything here in the terms of the looks and the people and the rough and sort of poorly dressed chap from the country who hasn't yet changed his boots, and that type of thing. So they did usually seem to enjoy it. I'm sure there were some people who were thoroughly upset, and I have no idea what someone, say for instance like Alicia McCartney, thought of that particular print, which is not a very good one of her, but she might have enjoyed the publicity as well, given the way that she was likely to use the press.
Thank you, Elaine. Ian?
Back on again. Two quick questions about your slides. So the first from Brenda, which was the John Marsh quotations. What was the source of those quotations?
The John Marsh quotation is from, just a second.
I'll put it on the screen. Which one is it?
I don't have, I didn't put that quotation in there.
Okay.
It is from, oh gosh, I haven't got it here. It's
show us your footnotes.
Elaine, don't worry, because we can put it in the answer.
There is a publication that dates from, I think it's 1998, which is a combination of his diaries. He left something like 28 volumes of diaries. And it's a Sociology of Music Working Papers number 9. But I remember that. I can't remember the actual title of the thing, but that's what it's in. I
think you can tell from the audience, we all know that one very well. And then the other one about the quotation is, and I say this advisedly as somebody born in Gloucestershire, the accents, this is from Alex, the accents referred to in the Prince Charlotte sketch, could they be mocking the West Country accent rather than the Irish?
Probably not, because when the West Country accent is mocked, it is always, S's are always spelled with a Z.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Yeah. So if you saw on one of the,
it is one of the slides.
The Taste of Somerset, and it's always with a Z.
Whoops, gone the wrong way. My apologies. Let's go back. It's one of the. I think it's. Is it that one?
No, not that one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oops, I think that was it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Somerset is always spelled with a Z.
Yeah. Is it that one?
No.
It's hard to see, isn't it?
No, that's just a master.
Oh, well, but it's in there
somewhere.
Right, in the room, there was one down the front, and then I'll start moving backwards.
Hi.
I enjoyed that very much. Thank you. As I'm not a historian, more of an economist, I'm kind of interested in how much we know about the wealth that, or the source of the wealth that funded all this polite and grand society, and if any of it, how much of it was involved in the trade, in the slave trade?
I can't actually answer that, being not an economist, but an economic historian. However, yes, definitely. Yeah, there's definitely a goodly amount of money that is coming from slave investment here in Bristol, in Liverpool, all the way around. There's money that is indirectly coming that way as well, because you're selling slave-produced products, sugar, cocoa. There's a wonderful advertisement in one of the Bath Chronicles for a new version of chocolate. For instance, that is coming in because it's so much better than all the others. Well, yeah, right, but probably. So the money is coming in. There has been and there is ongoing a National Trust project working on the legacies of slavery and their investment in country houses. There's also, I think, some work that's being done in Bath. Certainly there's been work done in Bristol for slave investment. I can't say how much. I know that right now the National Trust, because they're working on the assembly rooms, have actually identified from the list of subscribers those that had slave money links, and that's something that they will be making more of. So that is coming, but I just can't give you detail.
I can give you a little bit more context. If you were here last week, we talked a little bit about the Bath Abbey and the monuments on the walls of Bath Abbey, of which there was a large number, approaching 1,000. But a university in London, UCL, has done a lot of research into the names associated with transatlantic slavery. And in Bath Abbey, there are 128 monuments on the wall whose names appear in the UCL survey. So that's a significant number in a relatively short, maybe 150 years. So quite considerable, yeah. I would say. Let me take one in the middle there. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah. Sorry, it's Keris. Sorry, it's hard to see. You can see us. We can't see you.
Staying on theme, as you'll know, Barry, there are many volunteers in Bath who've done lots of work on uncovering Black history, and contrary to popular belief, there's actually quite a lot of evidence about it. So when we have our new WH management plan, do we think that it would be helpful to have in that some reference to the Black history of Bath, in order to try and help some of our heritage organisations to be as courageous as perhaps some of the volunteers are in going out there and actually being very outspoken about what's out there, because some of them, I think, are very scared of the backlash.
Yeah, I'll pick it up and then get to you. My own personal take on this as a historian is that what we want to be able to do in terms of dealing with heritage at any point in time is provide the widest and most comprehensive understanding of the past as we possibly can. And that means, I've spent my life as an academic largely reimagining and recovering and re-exploring women's involvement in the political life prior to suffrage. I've done a huge amount of work with that, and looking at how societies that seem to be were extremely patriarchal still provided ways and means for women to move through that. We need to be able to do something similar in terms of our history of race, just as we need to do it with our history of class. What I've talked about today is largely elite. There is a whole another history and another story to be told around the class dimensions in Bath and the working people of Bath. Similarly, for anybody who's involved in the Black history of Bath. I'd love to know more about it. Absolutely.
Yes, you're quite right. Both Keris and Elaine are both right. There's a lot of work being done, and not a lot of it has surfaced in the way in which I think many of us would like to see it surfaced. With regard to our management plan, every World Heritage Site has to have a 6-year management plan. So it's a rolling plan. We have a current plan which expired in 22, and we're currently working on 23 to 29. We have done a lot of work so far as a World Heritage team, but we can't get to the stage of the consultation with you, the public, for a little while yet, because Historic England are providing some new advice as to how to present a management plan in today's digital world. And we obviously want to be digital. We don't want to have to produce a big A3 document. And will be important once we're able to take up Historic England's advice and get to a public consultation for people like you, Keris, to come, and I know you will, come along and actually say, why are you not saying this? Or we need to say more about transatlantic slavery or whatever it is. And as an organisation in World Heritage here in Bath, like many organisations, and the Abbey have done a fantastic amount of work on names associated with the Abbey. What we chose to do was to invite a mature student doing a heritage degree at a master's level at Bath Spa to come and work with us as an intern over a period of around 6 months to do his own research into transatlantic slavery and the people, and focused his report on, I think it was 12 people who were involved in transatlantic slavery. And they weren't all of white-skinned race. There were a whole range. And the key was to focus on how all this intermingled together in Bath, because there's always been a lot of talk about people in Bristol involved in the transatlantic slave trade living in Bath and bringing their wealth to Bath. And it's really, really hard to track all that down. And that's why we need all the various people who've expressed an interest and done some research to come together so we can get it into the management plan. Because we, just as Elaine says, we have to understand our history before we can move forward into the future. And the future is going to be difficult enough anyway, across a whole range of things. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. We're not there yet, but we will be in a public consultation quite deliberately. I'm going to go to Ian, and then I can see a couple of hands towards the back. Ian, to you.
Yes, quite a few questions on the chat. We'll start with a biggie from Graham here, which is Bonash. And a simple question, but I suspect a complex answer. How important was he for the growth of 18th century Bath?
I can write books on that.
Yes, I was going to say.
How important was Bonash? Bonash is not Bath, although he sometimes may have thought that he wanted to be Bath. But Bonash is really important for providing a guiding ethos, I think, and that's one of the things that he does. He not only is useful in terms of, hiring the Pumpernickel Band and all of that kind of stuff, but in terms of a guiding ethos and for embedding the kind of developing politeness which allows him as a non-elite man to be able to exert power and control over a very diverse community of people. And of course, remember in the beginning, he's getting, the courtiers in from, Queen Anne's court, who are used to having nobody tell them what to do. And so consequently, using this sort of developing change in the development of society to be able to use it for his own good. He's also, of course, involved in gambling and in various other things, But I think in terms of the social importance of that, he is important, and I don't think we can ignore him.
Another one, Ian?
In which case, this is from John. Were those involved in gambling and prostitution or using prostitutes the same gentility as those who were at social events who slipped off for a while, or were they completely parallel?
I think you get both, actually.
Right.
So some of them would have been the same people exactly. Gambling was something that was very, very common in society all the way through. There was card playing was the evening entertainment for many, many people. Whether it was very discreet gambling of the kind that you're betting a penny or a little bit more than that, or you were betting huge amounts of money and basically losing your estate on, which of course Bonash supposedly stopped several young men from doing. Those kinds of things happened both in respectable Bath society and in decidedly not respectable Bath society. And the use of prostitutes or the picking up of what we would later call demi-reps, or bringing your mistress to Bath. Again, the notion of men having mistresses or sexual dalliances outside of marriage or whatever was something that was not unusual at the time. So you would have had some people who were, specifically not interested in the respectable side of Bath, but a lot of people might have actually slipped between both sides.
Okay, now Joel's at the back with the microphone, so if you could give it to the person with the hand up, that would be fine. Thank you.
Was it you? Thank you. I enjoyed the talk very much. George in Edinburgh produced the Scottish Enlightenment, Hume, and all those people. George in Bath doesn't seem to have produced anything with quite the same amount of intellectual heft. Is that fair? And why not?
That's a good point, actually. I think partly one of the reasons is that Edinburgh is a university town, and that's really important, and it's got a very important university in the 18th century. The Scottish Enlightenment is a different ballgame than what we are looking at here in southwestern England. And also remember that this is a spa town, and so people are coming largely for short periods of time. They may come for 6 weeks, a month, maybe 3 months at a time. The French, when they're talking about Nice, talk about the fusion annuelle, and that creation of society that is done very, very quickly in a spa setting and then dissipates almost as quickly. And there was always the argument that if you came to Bath, your spa friends you wouldn't necessarily keep up with when you saw them again in London. So, there were some that you did and some you didn't. So I think that there's that. We do get people who are writers and thinkers certainly coming here. And certainly we get medical men who are writing treatises and things here. But I think that the kind of combination of thinkers specifically connected to the Scottish Enlightenment and in Edinburgh connected often to the university in one way or another just isn't here.
I'm just going to, before we come back to a question, I'm going to ask Ian, because of the this institution is approaching its 200th anniversary in next year in 2024. It's quite interesting to think that 200 years ago, so in 1824, this institution began. So at last we were moving into what you might term the quasi-intellectual world, perhaps. Ian, do you know more of the history? Do you want to say?
A little bit. I mean, actually, and the undergraduate course I mentioned was on the Scottish Enlightenment, so I feel that difference very clearly. Yes, I mean, I don't know enough about that period beyond what I've read in the books that BRLSI has published about the increased interest from the late last quarter of the 18th century onwards to gather together into intellectual societies. Of course, that's not That's not peculiar to Bath particularly. Bath's a bit late, I think, would perhaps be fair to say, in terms of other sort of literary and philosophical societies. There are ones that start and stop and start and stop, and FRHistS is the one that sticks around, partly because an unfortunate event gave us an opportunity. The lower assembly rooms burnt down. You showed them on your slide in their former glory, and the institution was given purpose-built space in its stead. So I would say, just to finish up a typical kind of academic response, because it's our bicentenary next year, we'll know a lot more next year.
So that means you just have to come back and listen, because there's going to be a whole lot of lectures around what's happened over those 200 years. Now, time's moving on. I'm going to take just two more questions. I know that there was another one at the back. Yes?
It was really just a comment when you were talking about the plans to integrate and to share the history from the Black history and the heritage. But it was a comment really that, and I spoke to you, Barry, briefly before about this, is that I feel quite strongly of making the UNESCO World Heritage position valid for people, for all mankind in Bath, and particularly modern mankind. And I feel your difference when you said at the beginning about the difference the only differences between people within Bath is our heritage and our culture. And I would just like to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing so that we can bring other people in our communities together into this World Heritage arena.
Oh, that's very kind. I certainly would intend clearly to do that. It is just so important in today's world. It was important before, but nothing much was happening about it. So is there one further question from you, Ian, before we finish?
Just a very quick one. It's quite a specific one around World Heritage, and this is from Trevor online. There's a meeting tomorrow night, apparently, with the National Trust are going to outline their plans for the assembly rooms, and it was just to check that the World Heritage group were involved in the discussions around that.
We're involved in the discussions. We're not presenting or doing anything like that. We do have the area leader, Tom Bowden, who is a member of our advisory board, so we're in very close touch with what's happening. We also, I was speaking only a week ago to the person who helped them to create the thinking behind what they're going to do with the assembly rooms, Celia Mead. And so, we are to a certain extent involved, and we will be more closely involved as things emerge. Right, we're going to stop there, and I have to just mention the Mayor's Guides, because I'll be in trouble if I don't mention them. They're brilliant. Give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. This is the summer series of talks, and again, they're all free. What more can you ask? And so I would just like to finish the fifth of our 6 talks by simply saying, one of the things we really have to think about is that heritage is important. Our past is important to help us move forward, as I was saying before, but actually world heritage is critically important to the future of our beautiful city. Thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate you coming. Thank you. Bye-bye.